You could make it as a general heading. I was going to start out just a sort of a potpourri tonight, but one of the things has to do with, very specifically, you could title it to do or not to do, or to do and not even seem to do. Because some of you may find it of interest to note at a sub-particle intellectual level a peculiar situation wherein two apparently opposing forces, operations, can occupy the same space. But just as in three-dimensional physics, when they find things peculiar, let us say, as they do in the world of quantum mechanics, so they say, when they find something peculiar at the sub-particle level, or subatomic level, let's say, you've got to remember that it's only peculiar looked at from the atomic level. Because if they could get down themselves personally to the subatomic level, or, for those of you who are making detailed notes, if they could take their brain, their own thinking processes, down to the subatomic level, then they would be seeing it at that level, and it'd no longer be peculiar. Which I guess, in the 3D world, would take away part of the physicist's hobby. But I guess you could remember that if you heard it, that things are only peculiar when they're looked at from a different level. But this is peculiar, and there's no available description for this. There's certainly no name for it, and all I can do is give examples. And the examples, let me caution you, I can immediately think up 2 or 3, and I could think of, I guess, 100. But the examples have almost no connection with the reality of it, which right there is peculiar enough, if that were true. But I'm going to have to pull out examples. But do not get involved with the examples. And the first ones that come to my little mind are those that have a certain propensity for inflammatory thought, which I guess is as it should be, for an example. But let us take, in contemporary affairs, several possibilities. How about the abortion question? How about animal rights? How about environmental activists? Believe me, those 3 have no particular consequence, but they do have the connections to a wide range of apparently sociological, civilized conflicts, questions, interest. But there is no subtle message, there is nothing hidden, there is no weight on one side or the other about this question. All right, on tape? And I mean that. ING, I didn't have time to put it in its correct form. Are they going to make you guys blip out visuals? Hey, well, I'll save you the favor. Every time I'm going to do it, I'll blip it out myself. Well, back to the kinds of examples. To do or not to do, or to do and not even appear to do. Let us say that we have a person who is an activist in the abortion question, one side or the other, it doesn't matter. Environmental issues, which in this case, at the 3D level, you do not have really those considered to be activists who are on the side of cutting down all those unsightly trees and putting up something decent like billboards. So the activists in this case are not as easily fissioned into 2 equal parts, such as the pro-life or the pro-abortion and the anti-abortion. And so you would have people that are called environmentalists, and I pulled out animal rights activists. You don't really have people who are actively, verbally proclaiming the contrary. But let us say that somewhere within that realm you have a person. The person is verbal, the person is visible in their interest in this matter. They're out marching, picketing, trying to get people to sign referendums, petitions, and the person periodically would appear from a 3D view to have some effect, to get something done. Perhaps we have a localized spatial area wherein there's a question about, let us say, turning over some governmental parklands to developers, let's say. And we have this person who is wired up to be an environmental activist. And this person, amongst perhaps others, goes through all sorts of political gymnastics, public activities, and by all news reports, which let's take it as being indicative of a fairly normal three-dimensional view there at that time and place, that this one guy, and perhaps some of his cohorts, apparently have stopped the proposed destruction of these public lands. Now, to the peculiar place that there is no note made of it within the ordinary intelligence of life in man, and I'm not going to guarantee that all of you are even going to hear this. No offense to your intelligence, unless you take any. And in that case, it's what you should say to yourself for being offended. Because it's very peculiar. This is not noted, and I'm not going to use this second example also as being a better example. I have not used the ordinary example of this environmental activist as being the routine man, as opposed to me about to now pull out some sort of idealized or some revolutionary. It's not that. Not yet. So just try and listen. Let us say that they're at the same area where they are considering the destruction of the public lands. That there is another, what shall we call him? A person. There is another person there who has, what shall we call it? Similar interest. I like that. Similar interest. And yet this person is not vocal, is not visible, and at a intellectually subparticle level. That means something. Trust me. Figuratively speaking. Trust me. This person does not get involved, and it's more or less on the basis of me putting artificial words on it. It is almost on the basis of them perceiving an impossibility of them individually having any effect. Now, I'm not talking about some mechanically wired up fashion of pessimism, to wit, if we jumped into this guy's brain, this person, and said, well, you used to be interested in environmental issues because I used to read your mind when I was not doing anything else. And you went, yeah, I still do. Well, now, right next door to you, they're about to destroy that beautiful part and they're going to turn it over. Yeah, I know all about it. I haven't heard you say a word. I haven't. Well, why not? It would not be then on the basis that this does happen in routine life, or some guy then saying, well, what difference does one person make? We're dealing with crooked politicians, the lumber companies, the developers involved with this certainly have more of a wherewithal with the political powers that be than I do, and blah, blah, blah. It's not that. The figure I'm describing would not say anything. He would not give an excuse, would not have expressed some form of pessimism regarding the impotency of the individual against large organizations, institutions, the business world, etc. Not that. But it would be a kind, and I repeat, it's artificial, because if such a person existed as I'm describing in the 3D sense, it was not a form of pessimism. It's not a form of impotence as perceived by the person, if there was such a person. But it would be on the basis, I repeat a third time, this is artificial, my description, verbally. But it would be on the basis that the person had an understanding of the way things were generally structured right then, and would not see a personal profit in trying to rattle the cage. This is very artificial, very sketchy. It almost is odious. Because none of this is exactly what would be going on. But I also repeat, the person I am describing, if such a person existed, would have a similar interest. They, in fact, might be more intense in their interest. So you would have here in even one locale having to do with the same apparent situation, that is, the question of some public native areas being turned over to developers. And you would have one person, visible, vocal, externally, molecularly active in opposing it. And you could have another person equally as opposed to it and doing nothing, visible, vocally. The peculiar part, that wasn't it yet. The peculiar part is this: that the apparently non-active person could be having as much effect as the activist. Now, I told you it was peculiar. Of course, from a normally conceived particle level of intelligence, it's not only peculiar, it's insane. It cannot be. And even if somebody's ordinary intelligence could even for a second say, well, it could be, ordinary intelligence could not truly perceive it, yet it could be, because if it did, it would then still have favor with one or the other. And if you have favor with one or the other, then it can't be. You could be one of them, but you couldn't be either one of them. You could only be one of them. Now, I thought they'd clear it up. All right. Not so easily do we give up, do we? Sure, why not? All right. There is a kind of unrecognized strength that has no describable, no verbally useful life in ordinary affairs that has to do with silence of a particular kind and has to do with silent people of a certain kind. It defies all reason, it defies all expectations, and parenthetically I might add, does that not sound like, if we needed one, a fairly workable description of this kind of crap? Say, you cable company, you thought I was going to say shit. You said crap. Well, at least I didn't say well, I'm going to pretend to change the subject here in just a second and see if perhaps I can't sneak up on some of you people with it. But before I even overtly leave the subject, consider, because they already, if you didn't see any sort of connection, which wasn't the real point, but they already have such observations and such theories, theoretical structures in the world of subparticle physics, of not just general peculiarity, which they certainly have that from their view, but that by all measurable accounts they can have two objects, two forms of matter occupying the same space. And I fear that's only going to be a short period of time, if it hadn't already happened, that some physicist somewhere is going to have two or three too many old Milwaukees and go, wait a minute, I even think it's two entities occupying the same time. And then they're all going to tell them to lay down and rest. But consider, before I apparently change the subject, that it's not just absolute opposites, which was my misleading opening when I said a form of subatomic intellectual area wherein two opposing forces can occupy the same. Can you see that they're not opposing forces? It is not a pro-abortionist and an anti-abortionist. It is not a pro-environmentalist and an anti-environmentalist that I have detailed. It is one, try again, especially people on tape, try and pull yourself away from any particular attraction that you may already have toward these areas, because there is no commentary inherent in this at all. I like a tree as well as the next man, if that makes you feel better. I like a billboard just as well as the next fellow, okay? But it's not opposing forces, to use the example that I finally ran with. It is not that my first person is a pro-environmentalist and is trying to protect these public lands for the public use, as opposed to the second guy of saying no, for whatever reason. The most common reason being, well, public lands are fine, but jobs are more important. The welfare of the people around here is more important than a tree, as great as a tree is. Notice the second guy was not anti. He was not opposed to the first person. The force involved, if you can strip yourself away from me calling it a person, the force involved that would be driving this second person that I made up, the force is not in opposition to the first one. I tried to give some sketchy verbal guidelines by saying that their interests were similar. And I finally said, in fact, the second guy could even be described, that is, the second bundle of energy, is even being more intense. And yet the first one, from a three-dimensional level, let us call that the particle level for a second, intellectually. From that level, the first guy is the only guy doing anything. That is, the first bundle of energy here is the only energy actively involved with this, quote, question, matter, affair, transfer of energy. It's only the first guy who is doing anything. And at times, the first guy seems to move energy about, seems to have an effect on the circumstance. And yet there is a second, theoretical person, bundle of energy, could be involved with similar interests, perhaps even more intense in their interest in seeing certain kinds of energy transformed, who by all particle views, all three-dimensional visible views, by all sensual knowledge, this second person hasn't lifted a finger, hasn't done anything, never even said a word about it, and could be more intense in the energy, in the force to try and transform this energy in a certain way than the first visible. Why do you think that they keep refining the telescope and the microscope? You don't know why? It's because by the time they get used to, I'll have to admit, this may be getting allegorical for you new people, since I don't want to sub-paragraph every paragraph. And it may not be. But that is why once humanity, once scientists and everyone involved, get accustomed to a 100-power telescope, it begins to look funny and peculiar, and therefore they have to enlarge it or refine it if we're going in the other direction, which don't worry about the twain ever meeting because they already met, which is one place that gets real peculiar if they ever get there and see it. But as soon as the refinement of what can be seen reaches a certain level, then the peculiarity sets in and they have to keep refining the telescope and the microscope. And I will admit I'm using them allegorically. Consider all that being the refinement of being able to see, to be able to think in a certain way. Because once you can think in a certain way about something, if it doesn't look peculiar, you're not thinking. You have accepted your own first story. You have taken the analyzation of me, I'm recalling giving you a non-existent but operational definition of this. If it had one, you remember, I said would be a continual thinking about things when you didn't have to. Now, if your microscope, if your telescope, if your intellectual processes reach a certain level, and it seems like, well, now my perception of it matches the activity involved. It's the end of the story. But if you look further, it gets peculiar. And in the ordinary world, that is a continuing process of bumping up the stakes, and it appears to be progress. Well, it is progress in the three-dimensional world. It's the expansion. They redefine the technology, and then they apparently, in turn, add to their storehouse of information by enlarging the view, the precision of a telescope or a microscope, looking up and down. Then as soon as apparently their intelligence matches the level of information derived now through this new technology, read, new level of thinking, if anybody goes past the point where, aha, that which was peculiar before, now we understand it, because all we needed was a better view of it. Now we got our telescopes, and we got 2 or 3, and they're trained in certain patterns, and we've got more information. Now, that which was inexplicable, you remember last year? And yeah. Well, now here's the explication. Here's the explanation. Because now we understand it. Case closed, except if it's in an area where life is going to continue to grow, then somebody, that is some part of life's body through some body or some groups of bodies, will, after a certain length of time that they've become accustomed to this level of perception, will go, wait a minute, we didn't notice, but now that I've trained our new telescope over in this other area, yeah, I know about last year and how you explained everything, but if you look over here where I started looking, we have a completely new PS, peculiar situation. And that is the way progress has moved along, inter alia. Individually, people do not normally do this. That is not the way life is wired up at the individual level. Is why everybody takes the first story, and if you had any burgeoning intelligence out of the ordinary, you not only take the first story as satisfying, you simultaneously take it as being very unsatisfying. But ordinarily, people do not know what to do after that except dream, take drugs, chase religion, get dizzy, lay down. But if you think beyond where you have to, then everything that has any potential information in it, everything becomes peculiar. Everything becomes subparticle level. Everything belies the laws of whatever the physics were at the level at which the first story satisfied everyone else for the time being. I know, I'm with you. I'm certainly glad I hesitated changing the paragraph so that we cleared this up for you. Like George Gershwin or Cole Porter in London on a foggy day. Change the paragraph. Never mind that, since it's Friday. How about think back to one of my earlier sketches and ideas I gave you about a certain substance in the blood, AMV12. And for you people just getting here on tape at some other time in some other place, you'll have to make of it right now what you will, but I have pointed out that specifically there is a substance in the blood that has to do with the expansion of the intellect. And it's a kind of food, it's a kind of actual nourishment in the blood without which you cannot activate the brain past the point where it is now. And that's about all I've ever said, other than talk about it indirectly. But for those of you capable this near to a weekend of hearkening, hark back to what I have mentioned about AMV12 and connect it with another area of intentions. Because I have had numerous people that's been around this for a bit write me notes and letters, the speculations about AMV12, or at least asking why don't I say something more about it, or it's fascinating, or the whole idea. And I have people, several occasions I've had people even ask, well, if somebody had it, could it actually be tested and found? Which, if you want another little aside, is another area of peculiarity, not dissimilar to what I was just talking about the refinement of telescopes and microscopes, reading that as being paradigmatic of the evolution of an individual's ability to think in new ways, that if I told you that I meant it literally, that there is a substance, and I'm one that made up the name for it for my own reasons, but there is a substance in the blood that has to, and it's been inherent, or it's been extant in people who could think beyond whatever the necessary level was at the time, the minimal level, that it's always been there, course, ordinary intelligence then would want to say, well, is that what caused it? And I'd have to say, Jesus, I get tired of hearing from ordinary intelligence. But that's the way it goes. No, it didn't cause it. You're saying it did not cause it? No, I didn't say that. Just forget it, that part. But the question as to, well, if somebody had it, could it actually be tested? And so many people ask that question, I even liked you wanting to ask the question. And the answer is this. This is almost peculiar enough, I guess I could have thrown this in the first paragraph. You got to listen because it makes sense other than the fact that it's absolutely insane. But it's true. That if I am saying it's an actual substance in the blood, physical, material substance, then could it be, if somebody had it, could you take their blood and somebody look at it and find it? And the answer is no. Except, unless the person looking had it in his blood. Because ordinary people couldn't see it. Now don't tell me what kind of microscopes they got and what kind of tests. They could do everything they wanted to, but unless you had a person that had AMV12 in their blood, then they could not look at the blood samples, put through whatever processes and tests. They couldn't see it. There is the world of real intellectual quantum physics, by the way. Well, wherein all possibilities are true, they're not true, and the whole question about being true or not true makes the word moot sound irrelevant. All right, back to what I wanted to try and point out in general tonight, having to do with the AMV12 and a substance in the blood. I have said in the past, for you people on tape, that it can be produced. You've got to have the genetic, sad to say, you've got to have the genetic potential to be able to do it, and then being involved with this, although it's not the whole point or you would have heard more about it, but being able to think outside the spatial limits, I suggest is the sorts of things that might very likely add to you being able to produce the substance. And then you get to the question that some ordinary intellects wanted to ask about, well, then would the substance make you be able to think anew? Well, you do see it's in the three-dimensional world. One good thing about a loop system, with ordinary intelligence, it's frustrating. If you see other than that, though, there's a certain kind of replenishment if you know how to use it. Maybe we'll get to that in a second. The MV12, and people asking, well, if there's really something to that, if you mean that more than allegorical, then by God, that sounds like what I'm after, instead of worrying about the spirit of gods and deities or long-lost disembodied intelligence of some great guru or somebody coming into me. If you're talking about something, if that's the basis of it, something real, I want to churn this out. I want to produce it, and I'll put my liver into some kind of toxic shock or hook up, an stripped AC plug to my colon or something. Tell me how to do it. Or can you get it going? I mean, is there some trick? All right, here's the trick. One word, intention. But I told you I wasn't really going to change the subject, so. Here is the sub-particle insanity. It's not possible for you to start out anybody and to know how to do it. And yet, it is absolutely, inescapably true that you can't do it unless you intend to do it. What everybody likes to do is take out a few seconds and either ponder this matter or silently slip out and consider yourselves lucky and never return. It's a matter of intention. The area of intention, though, is strange because you can intend to do something even when you did not, as far as you know, ever intended to have this particular intention. That is, you can stop it in what would appear to be an absolutely self-consuming 3D loop, and so wait a minute, if I'm trying to do this, like really something unusual, if I'm trying to do this, whatever the hell it is, did I actually intend to do this? Did I sit down one time and decide By God, that's just the sort of thing I want to do. And the answer would be, at best, a distinct, I don't know. If you were ordinary then, and if you took that as being a valid response, which is very likely if you pursued it far enough along a lineal area, you would have to come to such a response. Just simply, I don't know. I don't know why I got interested in this. You should be well enough along, at least have the MV12 potential that you do not go, well, no, I know what got me. It was that guy that I went to school with. It was a time that my great aunt gave me such and such book. Or it's when I saw outside of Woodstock this guy with a robe and he went blah, blah, blah. I remember what got me going. Let's assume you're beyond that. That you understand that you don't know what got you going. You cannot recall, and you realize that there is not going to be any recalling of you ever intending to do this. So if you can follow into that, you have even upped the stakes of the insanity of it all, because now you've got to intend to do something that there's no way to know what you're doing to start with. Then you also got the question, well, I'm not even sure I intended to do this. I mean, I feel inclined right now to do it, and you say to do it, you got to intend to do it, but I'm not even sure that I ever intended to do this to start with. Doesn't matter. It cannot matter. It has nothing to do with more complex intentions. You have got to intend to do something chemically astounding. And to do that, there is only one way that has anything to do with an intergenerational mutation, that is, an expansion of you. The chemical alteration has to be in the brain. Now, of course, the attempts have always been around, the low-level attempts of drugs, alcohol, taking on a new local view of something, that is, attempting to undertake a new religion, attempting to absorb a new belief system of some kind, a package of information that was foreign to your wiring system, which is just another form of drugs. You're attempting to chemically alter what would seem to be yourself, but doing it in ways that will not have a one-lifetime effect. It's not possible. Surely all of you understand what I'm saying. You can certainly take drugs of all sorts and think thoughts that you've never thought before. That's why they're known as the hallucinogenic drugs or the... But it does not change the person. And if you think it does, of course, you wouldn't be here anyway. It does not change the person. It will certainly change you chemically for the time the drug's in you. Take them enough and it can have a lasting effect. But insofar as a drug of any sort, or as far as any three-dimensional based belief system, package of information, no matter how exotic or how new it seems to you, will not change your thinking. That is, will not expand it, will not make you think in a new area. You may think in an area that seems to be laterally eschewed from that which you're already thinking, but not into the area wherein you can be a silent one. You have got to intend to do it, and the intention is a chemical alteration in you, but specifically in the brain. You have got to be intending to do that, or it will not get done. And that's not even much of a starting description of how to do it, except you've got to intend to do it, even if you cannot verbally describe even to yourself what I'm doing, what my intention is. Or the other, even more spurious one that your intellect might come up with is, I'm not even sure that I intended to do this anyway, so why should I worry about intending to really do it when I'm not even sure that I intended to do it? To attempt to do, that is to pursue new information, is to get into the only 3D area wherein it is in fact a replenishable resource. Because in ordinary life, everything runs its course. They may still be pumping oil in Arabia, but when it comes to pumping the fuel to run the human intellect, in ordinary cases, it's already run its course. You're already if you're ordinary, you're already a dying well. You're already a dying civilization. All the gears, all the internal combustion engines, all the machinery is running down because you cannot replenish the resources. That shows a lot of silence. That wasn't even weird. But see, that's the thing about doing weird stuff for 30 or 40 minutes. Even I've caught on to this. Then too many of you keep hearing everything for the rest of the night is even getting more and more weird. The individual human thinking system burns itself out. There is a kind of low-level, non-specific awareness of this through a spectrum of humanity, always has been. And it comes out as such ideas as you're never too old to learn, or people who were publicly proclaimed that they still get out and read books even at the age of 50 or 60, and that they're out taking up new forms of exercise and trying to learn how to paint, which, that's part of the hobby, is to talk. There is a general nonverbal awareness that everyone's resources intellectually, which is what we're talking about now. We're not talking about down to the lower areas of the circuitry. It would seem to be, let us say, just the physical of keeping yourself healthy, active. But it's here. The resources are burnt up at a very early age, before you die. And with ordinary people under ordinary circumstances, there is no way to replenish this. They can try, and it's fine. It can be a hobby, and if you were having to live with your great aunt, you'd probably be better off if she did have a library card and did try to take up folk dancing or Albania straw matting or something, rather than sit around the house all day watching TV and trying to talk to you. I'll admit that. But individually, all of you should be able to feel this. There is no readily available way that you know of to replenish the resources that are initially fed the intellect. Now, I'll put it simpler. Those of you that have such a memory, which you should have, the spark of learning, of investigation, of discovery back when you were younger, let us say all the way from 12 on up to your teens, or probably into college with some of you, the curve went. And if it was pointed out to you, if you ever had occasion to think it, there were reasons, because life's always got a first story. But it is the resources of intellectual development at the 3D level are not replenishable. You burn out your fossil fuel, and it's like you are the planet Earth by yourself, and you have burned it out, and you're coasting. You're headed toward a form of entropy yourself, going into your last years intellectually. New information, I could call it this, but call it new information. But not new 3D information. It's got to be more complex. It cannot be local matters. It is only that is self-sustaining, self-replenishing. It would be a form even of non-serotonin fusion, I guess, that you would create your own energy. I say you can call it right now you, or you could call it the information itself. But until you go into an area of your own nervous system, into the brain, where there are as few as possible remnants, debris, leftover substructures on a building site, the further you get away from that and you can find a new place in the brain, is where you cease to be saddled with the limitations, the native limitations of thinking in space. That everything has to be connected, that everything is based upon opposition, and blah, 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 that we've been through 4,627 times. And I am not exaggerating, I've been counting them. Everything in life runs its course as it should. Your life runs its course, as witnessed by you being that kind of unrecognized yes man too far as long. But even before your life runs its course, everything else runs its course. The peak of your health, your sexual prowess, everything, not to give you the blues, but everything has its day. But it is here Not that you can't do something about other stuff, but I'm not here tonight to help you people with your other little penny ante problems, those of you that have penny ante sex lives. It is here that the peak is reached, and there seems to be no way. Ordinary people, of course, have no cause to recognize this, not specifically. But it is only here that there seems to be not even the appearance, not even scrap somewhere to replenish it once the peak day is passed. But if we're going to artificially split up a person just into, let us say, the motor and body functions, somebody 50 years old, after being a couch potato sitting behind a desk for years, can take up exercise, weightlifting, and running, and apparently become a new person visually. But here, people cannot do it. They don't see it as being a great problem, and there's no specifically known information about this, besides what I said of that general vague knowledge that can't teach old dog new tricks and how hard it is to learn, and etc. It is that this does not replenish itself in the way that is in any manner like unto being able to redo yourself physically through exercise and change of diet and etc. Assuming, of course, all that's not an illusion, but we can't go into that. Another description, although I wouldn't bet on it, and I wouldn't tell anybody publicly, but another description of this kind of activity is the struggle to replenish intellectual resources. But that would lead to a very, very, I think I can say this, serious new question. Serious new question. Are we talking about actually replenishing new intellectual resources, or the replenishing of one's ability to handle the intellectual resources? In other words, are we talking about information, or are we talking about intelligence? See, nobody's ever written me that question. Never. Which I guess is just as good a thing, because it would either scare you or me to death. Not that the question would scare me to death, but if one of you came up with it. Suffice it to say, if you can follow, again, it all runs its course under all 3D conditions. Whether we be talking about the information has become jejune, your ability to think has become gridlocked, petrified. It's the same thing. That if there was such a thing separate from the intellect as information, if it was actually stuff, if it was actually matter, and there was some new, and I had it behind this flat up here. I guess we said, make some of you people happy, if it was brand new, extraordinary software, can your hardware play it? Can you throw a CD on a turntable? But look at it another way. If you want to fool the world of peculiarity, what if you had an intellect primed, ready for the world of digital sound, and you had it, say, 20 years ago, and the best they had was analog records? Then you could be wandering around with this ability. In other words, you had a CD in your brain, the player, and no software. What's the difference? If any of you think there is a difference, I guess you can drop me a note. Of course, first off, I suggest you drop yourself a note. Once you decide, yes, there is a difference, drop yourself a note first. Send it to you, then open it and read it, and then decide if you want to send it to me. I'm looking at the clock. We're running out of time, as strange as it's been. Trying to end with something a little more straightforward. All right. How about something as sure and certain as 2 and 2 is 4? No need to laugh yet. I'm not being sarcastic. In the ordinary world, 2 and 2 is 4. We all know that. It's why I call it sure and certain. But how about this? How about if it was discovered that 2 and 2 were in collusion? Do you understand then that the certainty, the validity of 4 is now in serious doubt? But stay with the serial reality of it, that 2 and 2 is 4. But if it was discovered that 2 and 2 were in collusion, of course, secret collusion, do you not see, even though it produces 4, if it was already predetermined what the answer was going to be? Do you understand the collusion insofar as somebody with the desire, if not some ability to think anew, would then have to find all such information to be crippled? Even though, do you hear me, even though it has not changed that for all reasonable purposes, for 3D reality 2 and 2 is still 4, but to find out that you have had 2 princes in collusion, even though 2 and 2 is 4, it has now been rendered seriously flawed, if not totally invalid for any exceptional use. Even though it is 4, that they got together in collusion to make it 4, even though it was 4. If any of you can go beyond that and see where that begins to point around the corner, then me saying it could be flawed, seriously flawed, could be crippled, might be invalid, it's not any partials, maybes. It renders it obsolete. It is the end of that inquiry. It is the end of that level. And to look further makes the whole situation become peculiar anew. That 2 and 2 is no longer 4, but 2 and 2 is not 4 either. It's not 4. It is simply that the information is no longer valid in that it was predetermined. In that 2 and 2 was in collusion. Does that not, if you've got the ability to hear in an exploratory manner, can I not ask you rhetorically, does that not sound like, forget anything specific, does that not sound like a fair liming of all information? Because you've got to have the hardware to use that and go, yeah, you're right. That all information is, in that manner, crippled. Not at the level at which it operates, because at the atomic level, all atomic affairs are quite sane, conclusive, or at least with reasonable operational premises to carry forward. It is only when you get to another level, it's only when you have refined the microscope or the telescope or your thinking to the point to get to another level, that then it becomes peculiar. So it's not that 2 and 2 is not 4. 2 and 2 is not 4, but it's not that it's not 4. But it's beyond that that it becomes peculiar. Well, the obvious peculiarity verbally is, which is good for 2 or 3 seconds worth of peculiar insight, is, wait a minute, I now see that 2 and 2 is not 4, but I also see that 2 and 2 is not 4. It's not that 2 and 2 is not 4, but it's now I understand how it got to be 4, and it's invalid. That is, I can't use it to go any further. I can certainly use it if I'm going to have an arithmetic exam tomorrow. You know, and I hope, sweet Jesus, if they're going to grade me, that I remember that 2 and 2 is 4. But you can't go any further with that. Need I add that I am inferring that there's much more to it than the simple matter of 2 and 2 being 4, for those of us who consider it reasonably simple. Well, how about this, instead of mathematics? Can any of you perceive that a 3-dimensional pointing north, if you had a vantage point that was 5-dimensional, this, as valid as it might be, pointing north, might be a pointing east. That would be much worse, but there's no way for me to describe it. But to simply take that here it is on one level, that let us assume, from looking at this, the 2-dimensional flat that we're pointing on a map, north. Let's call that north. That there is no doubt, as sure and certain as 2 and 2 is 4, that I'm pointing north in a 3-dimensional world. There's no way to disaffirm this. It is a fact. And yet, from a more complex view, from a five-dimensional view, almost from a four, but from at least a five-dimensional view, I am telling you it could very likely be then pointing east. But does that make this incorrect to say, well, it was pointing north, but we got somewhere else, and what happened was, I don't know, through going through some kind of science fiction worm or black hole or polka dot hole, that suddenly things got twisted and it got to be some kind of Spielberg special effects, and now the person's pointing there. Now, it doesn't invalidate this. Just because 2 and 2 might be discovered to be in collusion does not mean that 2 and 2 still does not make 4. But the information is now invalid to a revolutionist, to any area of new intelligence. If you've got collusion going on, the outcome is dysfunctional. It is dead end. It is a first story. It is a final, if it's left there, deplenishing of the intellectual resource. That's why it makes sense. But the collusion in life is that on the intellectual level, for all things that life needs for the time being to keep things growing, that the things must make sense. Therefore, 2 and 2 is 4. And that north is north. But 2 and 2 is 4. And forget the fact, if that be a fact, that from a more complex view, this is simply a collusion. It's a conspiracy between 2 and 2 to make it 4. Yeah, but it's still 4, isn't it? Well, yeah, but it's a conspiracy. You know, so what? I mean, it's crazy enough to say, but well, so what? It's still 4, right? You agree to that, yeah? So if it's a conspiracy, what does that matter? And there you are. There is a difference between this and that. What does it matter? It doesn't. That's that. But from this, to say, well, what does it matter? Everything. That's it. That the very things that do not matter, the very things that are inconvertibly true, the very things that finally come to some conclusion, the very senses that have a period are the very ones that have no period. They're the very ones that are the living epitome, the poster child of inconclusiveness. No, I don't mean Dan Quayle or anybody. You people shouldn't make me do contemporary jokes because they're no longer funny. Well, you could look at, if nothing else, at trying to remember one of my new laws of physics. Because it literally is true. That premises that are found to be conspiratorial in nature can do nothing other than produce invalid conclusions. And you may make a note to yourself, say, find exception to this. I mean, anybody that really is hard up for a hobby. I've been notified that we have less than 5 minutes left. And I considered saying Farina over and over and over for 4 or 5 minutes to desensitize the local cable company here. But I think I'll just wrap it up in a apparent circle and ask one more time in a non-inquisitorial manner, can you see a peculiarity wherein something that can be described, that which in the most simplistic terms can be described as the operations and even a hint at the thinking and feeling of a person, of an individual, can be described in a certain manner that seems to be a factor in an equation, as a two? My environmental activist. And then see, not the opposite, not his counterpart in the 3D world, but a conspiracy that is so subtle that it can't even be described within the life of life's own body, wherein there can be another apparent person, a describable three-dimensional creature, can have like if not more, even intense, more similar interest along the same lines, and be having a similar effect, if they're having any, as to the visible one, who did seem to have some observable effect, and somebody apparently doing nothing can likewise have an effect, and I'm trying my best to hint, at least as much effect. It is an area, by the way, it's a hell of a late date in the tape to get another by the way, but what little I read about the world of particle physics, last decade or so, people here and there have been hitting in their form at this. Not just of two things apparently taking up the same space, but two things are unrelated, apparently serving similar interest, when there is nothing in common of the two observations, the two entities, the two forces. They're not in opposition, they just seem to be totally unrelated. Now I'm not talking about the affair of particle world of things apparently being in communication that could not be. It's not that. It's two things being up to apparently the same thing. There seems to be in the 3D world, which you can cut it up, and there seems to be some sort of observable consequences that they have in common, but until you get to the point that seems to be a consequence, they got nothing in common. I don't mean they're in opposition. If there would be an example of nothing being in a conspiratorial fashion, it would be this. It'd be like finding that 2 and coconuts make 4. The wrap-up to the wrap-up of where I started was to consider that this is going on inside of your own nervous system, not out at some area next to a wilderness, not to lands in danger, not to an abortion clinic, inside of you. And the part that talks from certain levels, from certain views, apparently gets things done. And there's a part, if you truly belong in this, there's a part that from that same level of view does nothing. And to say it has the same interest is very peculiar. It's an insane form of quantum mechanics, and yet it can be up to the same thing, and you never hear about it. It doesn't talk, it doesn't march, it doesn't even deny that it's interested. It has no comment. And of course, if it did, you remember what the comment would be.